Thank you for taking time to listen to my short story, The Mirror. The story is part of a collection of short stories which can be found in my books Razor's Edge, 8 Tales of Horror and Suspense, and Razor's Edge 2, 8 More Tales of Horror and Suspense. You can see these books and more by clicking on the link below. They are also available through most online outlets, or feel free to ask your local bookstore to order them for you through the book wholesaler Ingram. Before we get started, I need to get through some boring stuff. So boring, in fact, I'm going to defer to my local robot to read it for me.
Copyright 2023, Mark A. Daniel. All rights reserved. The characters and events portrayed in this book are fictitious. Any similarities to real persons, living or dead, is coincidental and not intended by the author. No part of this book may be reproduced, or stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, or otherwise, without express written permission of the author. Author's note. All of these stories are set in the late 80s. The victims, or heroes, can't be rescued by a cell phone call, a text, or a post on social media. Enjoy.
The Mirror. Going once, there was a pause. Then, twice, a final pause hung briefly in the autumn air. Then the sound of wood striking wood signaled the finality of the deal. Sold to the man in the fifth row. The portly man behind the podium pointed his gavel at Kevin McGuire, who then let a sigh of relief cross his lips. He was going to be in enough hot water for paying $300 for what seemed to be nothing more than a decorative wall mirror. His wife would certainly think it was gaudy, but Kevin loved to collect old things. Kevin collected old books, old records, old magazines, and now he had an old mirror. The mirror was approximately 150 years old, according to the auctioneer. It had been passed along, sold, and traded numerous times. This time it was willed to the Halbert Memorial Baptist Church in Searcy, Arkansas by Betty Schumacher, who had passed away in July. It was just one of several items which brought a total of $2,063 to this year's annual October church auction. Kevin had seen the mirror and had known immediately that he would have it. He'd been prepared to go as high as 100, but apparently he was not the only one who was stricken with the particular beauty of the mirror. A fat man in a gray suit had stuck with him into the bidding after everyone else dropped out at around $75. At $200, the fat man's wife had elbowed him lightly in the ribs. At $250, she had elbowed him a little harder. At $290, she had burst out at him, and the bidding had to be held up while Irma gave her husband the what for of the situation. Kevin figured that if he had brought Julie, the fat man would probably have had the mirror for about half of what he himself had ended up paying for it. Kevin packed the mirror carefully in newspapers provided by the elderly lady in the church foyer and took it home. On the way, he thought about what it was he was going to say to Julie when she asked him how he had done today. Well, honey, I bought a mirror with a gaudy frame for $300. I figured we needed that more than a silly microwave oven anyway. What's for dinner? That was going to go over really well. He pulled his red Civic into the driveway of their countryside home and was met by Fred. As he tried to get out of the car, Fred did his best to push him back in. Hey, Fred, how's it going, boy? Kevin reached out and scratched the head of his big golden retriever. The ever-faithful Fred. Fred wouldn't care how much he spent on the mirror as long as it meant he could still sleep in the house at night. Kevin heard the screen door open on its squeaky hinges as his wife came to greet him. Hi, honey, how'd we do today? She called out as she walked to him across the lawn. Good, he called back. It went real well. I found something I'm really happy with this time. Julie reached him as he finally made his way out from under Fred's affectionate weight. Great, hon. What did you find? She asked him. Let me show you. Kevin decided to get her full reaction before she asked the price, just so he would be prepared for the following flurry of concerned words. Kevin walked around to the back of the car and opened the trunk. You bought a bunch of crumpled newspapers? His wife joked. Yeah, and I got a hell of a bargain, too, he kidded back. I figured we can use them this winter when we have to fire up the wood stove. He looked at Julie as she stared into the trunk, waiting. Well, here it goes, he thought to himself as he began to uncover the edges of the mirror. After a moment of digging, he pulled the mirror out of the trunk and waited for her patronizing words of encouragement and then the question. But Julie said nothing. She just stared at it. Kevin began to feel very warm as the magnitude of his troubles began to coagulate. Kevin, Julie said to him in a soft yet firm voice. Yes, hon? he replied, looking a little like Fred usually did when he saw the rolled-up newspaper heading his way. "Kevin, this is absolutely fantastic," she said. His mind couldn't quite comprehend the words that had been uttered and tried to rearrange them. "I'm sorry, hun, but I saw this mirror and just—" The words began to arrange properly in his head. "You like it?" "I love it," she said. "This is the best thing yet you've dragged home." "Next to you, of course." Kevin still couldn't believe exactly what he was hearing. "Where do you plan on hanging it?" she asked him, true concern registering on her face. "Well," he replied, "I figured I could put it in my study." "Oh, hon, could we hang it in the bedroom, across from the bed?" Kevin looked up at her in disbelief, but she showed no signs of insincerity on her face. She was very serious. "But that painting your sister did is hanging up there, the one she gave you at our wedding?" "I'll move that to the wall by the dresser. I want to put this in our room. I really like it. A lot." "Don't you think that it's maybe a little gaudy?" "Oh, for heaven's sake, no. The decorative borders will really set off the carvings in our headboard and nightstands. It's just perfect." It really was, he thought to himself. He had just been so sure that Julie would hate it that he hadn't even tried to imagine how it might fit in their bedroom. And it wasn't really gaudy at all. Actually, it was very stylish. It would do just fine in their bedroom. The question of price never even came up. Julie took down the painting of the Oregon coastline which her sister had made for her 4 years earlier. Her sister was quite good. She even had an oil painting shop in Depot Bay, Oregon. Julie moved the painting to the wall by the dresser while Kevin ran the stud finder over the wall across from the foot of the bed, looking for places solid enough to drive the nails which would hold the mirror in place. 20 minutes later, he and Julie were standing at the foot of their bed looking into the mirror. There was something whole about the image. The mirror hung on the wall about 5 feet up and down and 30 inches across. It had a decorative oak frame which had been apparently restained and refinished recently, perhaps in preparation for the auction. Julie had been right. Not only was the style similar to that of their oak bedroom furniture, but the stain was also even a very close match. He stood silently for a moment, and Julie turned to him. "I think it's great," she whispered in his ear, and she kissed him on the cheek. He put his hand on her soft but small stomach and kissed her back as they sat down on the end of the bed for a moment, then lay back. It was a cool autumn Saturday late afternoon, just right for lovemaking. The evening was uneventful. They rented a movie, The Stepfather, and ate pizza. The temperature outside was falling fast. It was going to be unseasonably cool tonight. The meteorologist had said 48 degrees. That was the coldest it had gotten since the spring. The night moved on, and Kevin and Julie headed to bed around 11:30. Kevin started to put Fred out, but Fred was particularly reluctant, and Kevin decided that he could stay in since it was going to be so cool outside tonight. Julie threw another blanket on the bed while Kevin took a shower. She also turned the thermostat up to 50 degrees, just in case. They went to bed and turned out the light. It was just a little after midnight. In the middle of the night, Kevin was awakened by a scraping sound which became louder and louder. He opened his eyes and noticed an eerie light coming into the room. It was coming from the mirror. He sat up in bed and looked into the mirror. There was an image, indistinct but moving, inside the mirror, and it wasn't him. He sat frozen while the image became more distinct. It was rocking back and forth, making the scraping sound. He turned to look at the clock, 7 minutes after 2. He looked back to the mirror. The image was much more distinct now. It looked like a man. He was doing something at the bottom of the mirror. As the image became fully distinct, he could see that the man was filing. The file came in and out of view at the edge of the mirror. The man seemed to be filing the inside of the mirror frame. The room behind the man was full of tools, old hand tools. There wasn't a single power tool to be seen. The room looked old and worn. The source of light was a single small window about 30 feet behind the man. There were other sounds too. He could hear running water as if a stream were nearby, and the sound of someone chopping wood. The man inside the mirror took a step back and looked directly at Kevin. Then he spoke. "It's finished," he said, looking toward Kevin with a dim smile on his face. Then the smile disappeared. "My God," the man exclaimed. "It's all black. What's happened? What did I do?" Kevin felt the warmth of panic in his limbs. He wanted to awaken Julie. He wanted to get up and take a closer look, but his body wanted to stay put. Then another man, a younger one, came into view in the mirror behind the old craftsman. He was breathing hard and was very sweaty, and he had an axe in his hands. The old man turned to face him. "Thomas," the old man called to the young one. "Thomas, come take a look at this, would you?" Thomas walked toward the mirror, his gaze locked on Kevin's. He got to within a couple of feet of the mirror. "The images have all gone, Thomas. There's nothing to see." Thomas continued to stare toward Kevin as if in a trance. "Thomas?" The young man turned to the old man. "It's the devil's mirror," he muttered to the old man. Then he swung the axe. Kevin screamed out as he watched the axe embed itself in the old man's skull once, twice, and again. Blood flew and splattered the mirror's face from the other side. The old man's body disappeared from Kevin's sight beyond the field of view at the bottom, but the axe continued to swing into the space where the man must have been. Kevin let out another scream as he watched the fury of the young Thomas release itself again and again. The young man began to laugh as he brutalized what pieces now remained of the old man. Finally, the axe stopped chopping and the image began to fade. Kevin could see the indistinct Thomas drop the axe. He heard the muffled thud as it fell to the earthen floor. As Thomas walked out of the picture, it faded out completely until Kevin was staring at an empty, colorless wall. He could see the reflection of the dim red light that was his clock in the mirror. He looked to his left at the clock. It read 7 minutes after 2. Exhaustion swept through his body, and he felt himself pulled to his back on the bed. His thoughts were flying aimlessly, and they became muffled as if from some outside force. He was back in the land of slumber just as the clock resumed its march towards 8 after 2. The following morning, Kevin was awakened by the sound of a gently falling rain. He looked over at the clock, 8:30. He turned to his wife, who lay in a soft slumber. The images of the morning session with the mirror played in the distant corners of his mind. Not all of the images were distinct. It was like trying to remember a dream. A dream, but an all too concrete one. What he could remember of what had happened was a series of images, not like those which are usually associated with a dream. He got out of bed and went to the kitchen to cook breakfast. The morning rain was going to put a damper on the plans he had made to do yard work. That was all right, though. In a few hours, the Cowboy-Redskin game was going to be on the television, and the 49ers were playing the Rams at 3 this afternoon. It was going to be a good day to stay indoors. Maybe he would even put the first flames of the new fall in the fireplace. The Cowboys won, and the Niners lost. As the evening set in, the drizzle let up. Kevin took Julie out to dinner in Little Rock to make up for his lack of activity during the day. He was always his worst during football season. Professional football was really the only sport he enjoyed watching, so when the season rolled around, he was pretty worthless on Sundays. Another nighttime came. Kevin had explained his dream to Julie that evening at dinner. She listened with that interest which begs for a new subject to be discussed, so one was. Kevin lay awake in his bed while his wife breathed slowly and deeply in her slumber. He thought about the problems he had left at the shop on Friday, which he was going to have to pick up in the morning. Ken Wallace was going to be in first thing, asking why his fuel pump wasn't replaced yet. It was one of the perils of working on the older Model foreign cars. He was thinking about how he was going to explain to Jane Browning that it was going to take another $150 to get her Subaru to pass inspection when he slipped off to sleep. He awoke suddenly to the sound of thunder. He lay looking up at the ceiling when a bright flash of light filled the room. Only the light didn't come through the window. It was coming from the foot of his bed. Kevin sat up in bed and looked into the mirror. It was showing another picture. The image he saw was a dimly lit room that looked well decorated. It might have been a living area of some sort. There were pictures on the opposite wall and a large chair next to a sofa. On the sofa sat a woman. She was wearing clothes that seemed too frilly and full to be from the present. She was shivering and wet. Another flash of light lit up the room. Kevin looked at his hands, then he looked at the clock. 7 after 2. He looked back over at his wife, who lay undisturbed and motionless. Totally motionless. She wasn't even breathing. He began to panic and found that his movements were quite restricted. A piercing scream brought his attention back to the mirror. The woman on the sofa was pointing at him while she continued to scream. He could make out another figure in one corner of the room. "There," the woman screamed. "There! Look at the mirror on the mantel. It's turned black. There isn't anything coming out of it." "Calm down, Veronica," came a smooth and steady voice from the back of the room. He still couldn't make out the face. "It's only a trick of the light." The light seemed very odd to Kevin. Then he noticed that what dim light graced the room was emanating from a couple of old oil lamps which were casting their limited light about the room from a table near the window. No, Charles, came the response. No, it's soaking up all the light. Relax, came the heavy voice. Kevin could see the form getting closer to the woman on the couch. There's nothing to worry about. As the image from the shadows stepped into the dim lighting, Kevin could see that there was, in fact, something to worry about. The man approached Veronica from behind the couch. He, too, was soaking wet. His shirt was torn, and he held a knife over his head. The woman continued to stare, transfixed by the mirror which she apparently was looking into. The man put his left hand on her shoulder. Something is very wrong, Charles, she stated. How true it is, he said as he brought the knife down into the back of her neck. She let out a stifled scream as the blade sliced through her velvet skin and into her throat. A look of incomprehension played in her eyes as she turned her gaze to that of the man's. He pulled the knife out and brought it down again, this time into her skull. Kevin watched in horror as he was not spared witnessing the following bludgeoning as he had been spared the night before. This time everything was in plain sight as he watched the man bring the blade down over and over. The man began to laugh hideously as another flash of light brightened the room, his white shirt now covered in blood. The laughter continued as the image faded. A moment later, Kevin was staring at the dark outline of himself. He tried to scream out again, but could not. His mind ran in circles while he tried to understand what it was he had just seen. This wasn't a dream. It couldn't be. He looked over at his wife, who remained motionless. Then a wave of relaxation hit him hard, and he was pulled back to the bed. He had never felt so exhausted in his entire life. The images he had just seen became less and less important as a darkness covered his conscious mind. A moment later, his wife resumed her breathing. The clock clicked over to 2:08, and Kevin was in a deep sleep. I think I'd really like to move the mirror into my study, hon, Kevin said over breakfast. I think it would go much better in there. He'd awakened this morning with more muted memories of a distant dream, a dream which seemed to center around the mirror. The patches he could recall were very unpleasant, and he was beginning to feel that perhaps he should do something about it by moving the mirror. I really think it adds that touch to our bedroom that finishes off the atmosphere, Julie responded. I really would miss it. Think about it today, and we'll discuss it this evening when I get back from work, okay? All right, she replied half-heartedly, but I don't think I'm going to change my mind. Kevin looked up at her. Just think about it, okay? Sure, hon. No need to get upset. I'm not upset. Kevin's voice was becoming a little louder and his face a little red. Whatever you say, hon. Kevin got up from the table, his breakfast half-eaten. Aren't you going to finish, hon? Kevin walked to the front door and answered without looking back. Not hungry. He closed the door firmly on his way out. The day was slow and uneventful at McGuire's auto shop. Todd Vogelsinger brought his Toyota pickup in for the fourth time in the last 3 weeks, and Bert had spent most of the day covering the backlog created when Jimmy didn't show due to the Monday flu. Ken Wallace had, in fact, shown up first thing in the morning, and that had taken up almost an hour of Kevin's time and most of his energy. Throughout the day, the images of the previous night faded in and out of his mind, sometimes seeming as bright as reality, other times seeming a faded semblance of a dream. When Kevin got home, Julie had dinner ready. He could smell the chicken when he opened the front door. Chicken was one of his favorites. He figured this meant he was probably going to lose the argument about the mirror. Julie had thought about it, and she had probably spent most of her time thinking about how she was going to get her way this time. His ideas were confirmed when she walked into the living room wearing the turn-on dress. Hi, hon, she said in a voice that was a little softer, a little sexier than the one she usually used. Yes, he was going to lose this one tonight, but it was going to be an enjoyable loss. Kevin lay in bed looking up at the ceiling. He was, for the moment, a very happy man. There were times like these that he felt almost animalistic in his approach to life. He could barter away a point of view for the simplest of pleasures. But this was life. It added a variety which colored his daily existence. It was a game which was, most of the time, enjoyable. He wandered off to sleep with these thoughts in his mind and was awakened 3 hours later by the sounds of music and laughing. One more time, Kevin sat up in bed, and once again he saw the images. He knew this was real. It had to be real, and he was going to remember this time. With his right hand, he dug his nails into his left arm until it bled and pulled deep scratches across it. He screamed out in the pain, the very real pain, and the images in the mirror remained. There were people all gathered in a large room. There was a band playing and people dancing. The music was very recognizable as Charleston style, and there was a lady dressed in 20s garb dancing on the table in the middle of the room with a group of people cheering her on. The room was filled with smoke, and Kevin could even smell the aroma of the pipes, cigars, and cigarettes that filled the air of the room. Some of the smoke even seemed to trickle out of the mirror into his room. Alcohol was being consumed in all corners of the crowded room, and everyone was having a gay old time until the lady on the table pointed toward Kevin and screamed. The crowd around the table turned around and faced him. Looks of astonishment colored their faces. The band came to a stop, and the rest of the eyes in the room turned to Kevin, to the mirror which hung in this long-ago party room. Someone dropped their glass. "My God," came a voice from the crowd. "Damn peculiar, I say," came a very aristocratic-sounding voice from the crowd around the table. Another voice, a woman this time, exclaimed, "Where's the reflection gone?" And another, "What does this mean?" Finally, someone decided that this was a joke being played on them by their normally benevolent host, Joseph Rickard, and promptly shared this piece of insight with the crowd, which was only partially receptive to the explanation. Then Mr. Rickard stepped in the door at the right side of the room. He was dressed very much like a Chicago gangster, and in fact he held a Tommy gun in his hands. The stately voice spoke out once again. "What's the joke, old boy?" it asked. The response was simple. "No joke, James." Then Joseph sprayed the room with lead. Screams flew and people scrambled, then dropped one by one as the bullets tore their life from them. The stately man was removed from his stately voice when a bullet flew through his neck, and the woman on the table was thrown to the floor with several holes in her face and chest. There was no exit other than the one Joseph stood in. Some people hid under the table and some ran towards the window, but they were cut down before they could get to the already shattered panes. Joseph continued to shoot, changed the magazine, and fired some more. Bodies fell and more bodies fell. Even the band was not spared. And when everyone was on the ground, he walked through the room shooting all of the bodies just to make sure no one was faking, and 2 of them were. And they were then filled with twice as much lead as the others. When he was finished with the carnage, he stood in the middle of the room and looked at the carpet, which had been white just a few moments before and was now a deep red everywhere. Joseph pointed the gun into the air and fired the remaining rounds while he laughed loudly. This was the final image. Joseph faded out shooting and laughing and shooting. After the image faded completely, Kevin heard a few final shots, then silence. He tried to get out of bed. He was going to move the mirror right now, but his legs wouldn't move. Then his arms became heavy and he realized what was coming again. "No," he thought loudly, but his lips refused to form the words and his mind began to cloud. Moments later, he was lying down, his head in his pillow, his mind fighting the end of a futile fight before it shut down and let the unconscious take over. The clock clicked over to 2:08. The next morning, Kevin felt a burning on his arms when he stepped into the warm shower. When he looked, he saw deep scratches he had made the previous night, and he knew what he had to know. The images were still distant and dreamlike, but he knew he'd seen them, or at least he knew that he was really sitting up in bed and experiencing something more solid than a nightmare. He didn't know exactly how he was going to get rid of the mirror, but he knew he had to. He wouldn't even use it anymore when getting ready for work. Julie had picked up on that and given him a bad time. He decided the best thing would be a talk, a serious one. Not this morning, but this evening, after he'd had some time to figure out exactly what to say. He thought it out that day at the shop. Bert and Jimmy had both shown up and both had kept relatively busy, so Kevin stayed in the silence of his office, thinking about what he was going to say and how he was going to say it. That evening, Kevin arrived home to a steak and potato dinner and an affectionate wife, 2 of the things he liked most about life. As they finished their meal, Kevin decided it was time to discuss the mirror. "Hon," he said, "I want to talk about something serious for a minute." Julie put her fork down and looked at Kevin. "What is it?" "It's about the mirror." Kevin noticed Julie's face becoming darker as if it were turning to stone. She didn't respond and her gaze became unbearable. "I think," he began, "that I would really feel better if we could move it. I've been having more dreams like the one I told you about at dinner a few nights back. I think—" "What?" she interrupted. "What? You want to move the mirror because of a stupid dream?" Her stone face was becoming red with rage. This was a response for which he was little prepared. Then the mood swung violently around as she broke into tears. "I can't believe it. I just can't believe you feel this way." Kevin had never seen her react like this to anything before. It wasn't rational. "It's just a silly mirror, hon." "That's the whole point," she broke out through sobs. "That's the whole point." Julie got up from the table and left the dining room. This was too weird. There had to be something else wrong, or maybe it was a combination of the stress and other things. There seemed to be no rationality in those panicked eyes that looked at him as a child might look at the bully that had just pushed that child into the mud on the first day back at school. He was sure that he was going to be able to convince her of his way eventually, but he really hadn't anticipated this reaction. How could he? He'd never seen her like this, ever. He decided that for the time being he would have to live with the haunting dreams. He decided at work that the dreams were in fact illusions in which he had become intimately involved, thus the scratches. While he figured out another approach to the problem, perhaps there was a compromise somewhere to be had. Perhaps. The rest of the evening was rather silent. He apologized to Julie, but she had not acknowledged the apology, and he'd been forced to spend the evening watching television alone while she moped in his study, finishing crocheting a sweater. The evening crawled toward night with a special lethargy as he sat in front of the television, only pretending to watch the images which flashed in front of him while he pondered the situation. But night did finally come. Kevin crawled into bed and lay on his right side facing his wife's back. "Hun," he said, and he reached out and touched her shoulder. She shrugged his hand off. "Hun, I had no idea this meant that much to you. Let's go to dinner tomorrow and forget any of this happened, okay?" Julie didn't answer. There had to be something else wrong. Had to be. "Good night, hun." He turned his back to her, not expecting a response. He didn't get one. He reached up and switched his light off. He lay awake for over an hour trying to figure out what had gone wrong and trying to rework his strategy. Then he fell asleep. Kevin slowly opened his eyes. The numbers on his clock glared out at him. It was 2:05. His mind had become accustomed to waking up around this time, and it brought him to consciousness in preparation for what his subconscious mind knew was coming. He lay awake listening to the sound of the wind outside. Though his subconscious mind was ready, his conscious mind just idled. Right now, the only thought he had about the mirror was the strife it had caused between him and his wife. He really couldn't figure out her reluctance to cooperate on the matter. She didn't even seem willing to compromise. As he lay awake thinking, something strange happened. The wind stopped blowing. It didn't die down or fade away, it just stopped, suddenly. The steady humming of his clock stopped. At that instant, all of the images Kevin had seen on the previous nights came vividly into his mind. Now he could recall every facet, every detail of what had been taking place at this time each night. He looked up at the mirror and saw the reflection of a dimly lit bedroom with an oak bed and some nightstands, only it was not his room. Kevin reached over and tried to switch his light on. The switch turned and clicked, but no light came on. He tried to swing his legs out of bed, but they were frozen. His arms, however, were quite mobile, and he used them to open up the nightstand and retrieve a pen and a book he had been reading. He heard a scream coming from what seemed to be deep within the mirror, but he didn't look. Instead, he tore the front cover off of the book and wrote down the time and the word mirror in capital letters. He wrote down sketches of each of the incidences which he could clearly recall as the screams inside the mirror became two and then were accompanied by laughter. The sounds were hideous. The first scream was shattered by a thudding sound which was followed by several more. That scream became a shriek, then a squeal, then silence. But the laughter continued. Kevin wrote down everything he could in the darkness while the second scream followed the pattern of the first, trailing off and becoming replaced by thudding, slushy sounds. The laughter continued. Kevin finally looked up. The bed he saw in the mirror looked strange. The sheets were strewn around in disarray, and there were stains, red stains, covering the right side. There was a woman's hand up on the edge of the bed. Someone was lying on the floor on the side of the bed which Kevin couldn't see. The laughter became louder as its producer stepped into the room. At first, Kevin couldn't make out the image. His mind was trying to piece together the inconsistencies. Then it became clear. Standing on the other side of the mirror, looking into its deep blackness, stood a tall man with blood covering his body from head to foot. His right hand held a wad of deep black hair speckled with blood. His left hand held a 6-inch-long hunting knife, which dripped blood onto the floor. The man looked into the mirror for some time, his laughter held momentarily at bay. Then he said simply, "I understand now." The man walked around to the side of the bed which Kevin couldn't see clearly and bent down to the floor. He went out of sight, and the woman's hand which rested on the bed began to shake violently before it fell off of the bed. Terrible slashing and tearing noises filled Kevin's ears, and he felt as if he were going to throw up, but he didn't. The man got up and approached the mirror again. The knife was still in his left hand, but his right hand held something different from the hair it had held moments before. He stood once again before the mirror and held up the new prize for it. It was a heart. It was still beating. Then Kevin threw up. The alarm woke him at 7 o'clock. The lamp on the nightstand was turned on. When had that happened? And a bad smell came to his nose from somewhere close by. He sat up and saw that he'd apparently become sick in the night. On the floor there was the mess he had made. There was also a pen and the cover of a paperback book he'd been reading. Kevin was more than a little confused. He picked up the cover and noticed that there was writing on the blank side. The writing was something about the mirror. There was a time, 7 after 2, then the word mirror in capital letters. There was some writing about a man and an axe, but then the words disappeared into light scratches. The pen had apparently run out of ink. Kevin got out of bed, cleaned up the mess, and showered. When he came out of the shower, he saw Julie lying in the bed, staring at the picture her sister had painted for her. She usually had breakfast ready by now. "Hun," he called to her, "are you feeling all right?" "Sure," she answered. "I just feel like sleeping in today. You know how to make your own breakfast, don't you?" "Sure," Kevin answered. So he did make his own breakfast. Apparently, he was still on the blacklist. Today was a busy one at the shop. Bert came in at one point and simply exclaimed that they couldn't accept any more work for the rest of the week due to the backlog. It seemed that either everyone's carburetor had gummed up or everyone's fan belt decided to break within the past 24 hours. Kevin agreed. He sat in his office studying the book cover he had forced into his front left pants pocket. He knew that it was significant. He'd been able to make a few connections, but only a few. He knew that what he saw on the book cover was related to the reason for the illness that had hit him in the middle of the night without his knowledge, and it was connected to the scratches on his arm. Just how all of these things were connected evaded him, but he was trying to pull it all together. He knew that he'd had some kind of encounter last night, something like a very bad dream. The writing in the book cover said something about an axe, but he had no memory of that. The images that had come to him the first 2 nights were all but completely buried in the subconscious corners of his mind, and they would not come to the surface despite his serious concentration. The one thought that he was able to center on, though, was the mirror. He wasn't sure what the time etched on the book cover had to do with any of this, but he was trying to think of a way to find out. It was all in his own handwriting, but it seemed so alien to him. He didn't remember writing it down, and that's what spooked him the worst. Something was happening in the night, something very vivid to him while it was happening, but in his waking hours it was all a patchwork of disassociated pictures. The mirror. That was what it all led to, somehow. He knew that the mirror was becoming a wedge between him and his wife, but he also felt that it was threatening his sanity somehow. But how? And how was he going to clear all this up with the mirror being where it was? How could he move the mirror without causing what would certainly be their biggest and most damaging fight? What had Julie said? That's the whole point, it's just a silly mirror? But the mirror didn't seem so silly to Kevin right now, so he put together a plan. The evening was silent and uneventful. Too silent. The mirror had put up a huge barrier between Kevin and Julie. How odd, he thought to himself, that I was so excited about this thing, that she loved it so much, and that it has only caused us strife. He'd thought at work about accidentally breaking the mirror, but that would have to wait. It would be too obvious. He created a short-term and a long-term strategy. The long-term strategy was, of course, to smash the damn thing into 1,000 pieces. But he would have to arrive at that crescendo through a series of short-term ploys. Tonight he had to execute one of those ploys. As the uneventful evening passed into an uneventful night, Julie and Kevin went to bed with barely a dozen words passing between them since he had come home, most of them his. Bedtime came once again. Kevin had decided that the best short-term strategy involved not throwing up in the night and not scratching his arms to bleeding, and not doing whatever else he might do to himself or someone else as a result of that mirror. So he set his watch alarm, which was soft enough so as not to wake Julie, for 1 a.m. Then he turned out his light. It seemed he had just finally gotten to sleep when a soft ringing noise brought him out of a light slumber. He reached over and grabbed his watch, shutting off the alarm. 1 o'clock. Good. He slowly got out of the bed and walked to its foot, being careful not to wake Julie, and grabbed either side of the mirror. He pulled up and back, but the mirror wouldn't come. He struggled with it for 15 minutes before getting a flashlight out of the kitchen and looking behind the mirror. 2 of the hooks were twisted from the weight of the mirror and had cinched around the necks of the nails, making it impossible to pull them over the heads. He ran back down through the kitchen and into the garage where he retrieved the hammer he had used to hang the mirror. He came back into the room and slid the forked end under the nail closest to him. He pulled firmly and steadily. As it slid out of the stud, it made a screaming noise. Julie stirred, but didn't wake. He pulled the nail most of the way out, but he left about half an inch in. Then he went to the other side and pulled the other nail out. Finally, he worked the mirror off the wall. Then he laid the hammer on the floor and carried the mirror into his study where he rested it against his bureau. He went back to his room and crawled into his bed at 1:30. In the morning, he would simply react off of Julie's reaction. Perhaps she would understand his sincerity in the matter, but probably not. If it caused too much trouble, he would just throw all of his remaining short-term strategies aside and smash the damn thing right then. He was asleep by 1:45. The silence of the night was broken by the sounds of heavy steps. Kevin tried to ignore the sounds, but they persisted, bringing him to full consciousness. He laid in his bed listening to the heavy thudding sounds, which became loud pounding sounds as he became fully awake. He sat up in his bed to see a figure at the foot of it. She was putting the mirror back on the wall. "Julie!" he shouted at her, but she continued pounding the mirror back into the wall. "This has got to stop right now." Kevin got out of bed and walked over to Julie as she finished driving the left nail its final distance into the wall. He put his hand on her shoulder and she turned around to face him. "Julie," he said again, "this has gotten completely out of hand." Julie had a blank look in her eyes. "This silly thing is causing way too much trouble, and I'm going to put an end to it." As he spoke these words, he looked into the mirror, but there was nothing to see. There were no images at all, just blackness. In a rush, the images of the past 3 nights flooded into his head. The terror of the experiences renewed itself in his limbs, and the shock forced him to take a step back. "Why?" Julie said to him, ignoring the grimace frozen on Kevin's face. "Why did you move the mirror? I really wish you hadn't done that, I really do." Kevin was fixed on the blackness, which seemed to reach out for him from the glass. He stepped back against the foot of the bed and sat down. He looked up at his wife with the terror etched on his face as she brought the hammer down on his skull. "Why did you do it, Kevin?" she repeated. She brought the hammer down again and again, and she began to laugh. "Why?" she laughed out. "Why? Why? Why?" Her laughter slowly faded, and the mirror began to take on the reflection of the gruesome scene, and Julie stopped swinging. Then she dropped the hammer and let out a violent scream. The clock clicked over to 8 after 2. Going once. There was a pause, then twice. A final pause hung briefly in the spring air. Then the sound of wood striking wood signaled the finality of the deal. "Sold to the lady in the 3rd row." The portly man behind the podium pointed his gavel at Sheena McDaniels, who then let a sigh of relief cross her lips. She was going to be in enough hot water for paying $400 for what seemed to be nothing more than a decorative wall mirror. Her husband would certainly think it was gaudy, but Sheena loved to collect old things. Besides, she hadn't just been thinking of herself. She'd heard of the estate sale through a friend. Apparently the husband had died suddenly and the wife was in an insane asylum up north somewhere. Sad tale, but her gain. In addition to the mirror, she had also picked up some nice-looking utensils, a sweet rug, and of all things, a hammer. She had her husband in mind when she won that item for next to nothing. Thank you again for taking time to listen to my short story, The Mirror. I hope you enjoyed it. There are 7 more like it in Razor's Edge 2, and 8 stories in Razor's Edge 1, which can be found either online or in your local bookstore. Until next time, stay safe, and may you always see just your own reflection when you look in the mirror.